The second chapter, which has 14 pages in it, I just got 2-1, 2-3 on across the bottom of all mine. So each chapter will start with its number and then the pages behind it. I don't know why he didn't put pages in it, but anyway. I'm sure they meant to. But.
And I also read, because in the second chapter, talking about Hebrews 1, and so I read all of Hebrews 1.
You mean Hebrews or Deuteronomy?
Well, Deuteronomy, but also.
But it did mean you did read
else.
Hebrews 1. That's good.
It was something else too.
But I mean, in here it says to give them to them.
Carolyn?
Carolyn needs one.
There she goes.
Give her one.
Okay. Anybody else?
Yes, ma'am. That was what? I'm sorry. I know it does, but the page number isn't in there. The page number isn't in there.
You know they meant to.
Yeah. Well, but his wife did the design and everything, and
Cool.
I think that when it came out, he realized the pages had not been put in it. So.
Sure.
But we laughed about that because our son-in-law had already said, well, they have this page in here, but it's not in the book. And I said, that's right. So anyway, he had those pages. But I did them just for me, so that if I make a note and know where to go back, I'm going to look, I wrote it down as second chapter, page 3 or page 4, or 2-3 or something. Well, anyway, Deuteronomy is an interesting study. We're missing some folks today because they're not in the best of health today. So Kathy Sue's not here, and so I know that she's not going to be here. And Mary's not feeling the best of the day.
She's at the doctor.
But do what?
Candy's at a reunion.
She had
She
a
said.
reunion, I think. So so those are things there. So we have things going on, but. Yeah, I'm glad you did read Hebrews, because Hebrews is really a fabulous book in itself. But I want to go back to Deuteronomy, and you got to realize that Hebrews was written for the Hebrews, all right? And so that's one of the things we're looking at. But Deuteronomy was written really and truly for everything. There's no Old Testament book, as I've told you before, that has a greater influence on absolutely the formation of both the Jewish and the Christian faith, or thoughts and practice, excuse me. And its doctrine is the foundation of the Old Testament itself. When you read this, you're going to think, wow, but there's a lot of great information in it. And and he writes about it, and the way Mark Davis has written about it, I enjoy reading it. And so it really puts that. So I go back and read in Deuteronomy and these sort of things. But Deuteronomy is also of outstanding importance in the development of our Christian life and our Christian thought. And so it's important for us. As a matter of fact, we can go back and look in the Bible, in the New Testament, and Jesus quoted from the New Testament. Quoted from Deuteronomy in his own ministry. So we can go and look for those and find them where he had those passages. He does it in Matthew and several others where he's used that there. But you got to realize something interesting about the Jewish child growing up in the Jewish community. They had a lot of scripture they had to memorize. It became a part of them. That's why even as rough and rowdy as Peter and Andrew and James and John from being fishermen, they knew they had been taught. They knew their faith. They knew the Torah, which was on the scroll and was read in a synagogue, and also. But now the synagogue is one thing that he talks about in this book, the tabernacle. All right, and that's the tabernacle. As we'll get into that as you read it. It's all it is has 3 sides and no top. You know why it had no top? So they could look up to God, and God could look in on them. So, but it was part of the life of Christ and all of the disciples, because of their Jewish background, was to know the scriptures, and and then you got to realize where Jesus used his quoting of the Deuteronomy's verses was while he was in the wilderness, while he was being tempted. He was going through that. I don't know about you. Are y'all born? I'm going to clean down back here.
Did you say you can't hear?
Background noise.
Oh, because of heater?
But anyway, back to where we are, we're realizing that the leading ideas figured prominently in Jesus' public ministry as well, the book of Deuteronomy. Now, I know that you probably never thought of the book of Deuteronomy as being that way, because you've always thought, well, it's like, I think Mark may have said it in his, but it's like when we start reading the Bible, we're going to do it in a year. Well, by the time we get to Deuteronomy, we don't finish it. We just give up on it. I was amazed that our daughter has read the Bible in a month. And this year, she's already read it in a month this year. It was hard to do because you got to read the Bible in a month. You got to have a number of days where you got 4 hours of reading time, because you just can't, get it done otherwise.
The hard part, though, is not the reading. It's the understanding.
Well, and we have a tendency, because we do, you got to realize, in the Jewish language, in Hebrew language, there are no vowels, all right? And you read backwards, all right? And you read from the bottom to the top. So it's a really different, all right? So what happens in that, and this is what's become to us, we want to read between the lines, all right? In the Hebrew language, they literally had to put the vowels in, and what happened was the great rabbis that were the thinkers of them would look and have different vowels in there, like Yahweh, for instance. They would, because they couldn't say the name of God, and they didn't spell it. They wouldn't spell it all the way out. They would say G-D, all right? Or so they just, to them, that was not what they were supposed to do. They were not supposed to speak God's name, and so that's where Yahweh came around. But it's, if you see it, it's Y-W-H. W-H, in other words, and they put an A in it, Yahweh, all right? And so that's how it wound up being that. And so that's what they did. But we have the same tendency. What I was back to saying is when you and I read it, and I'm start reading it, it was like I was talking Sunday morning when Christ came walking up to the boat and Peter wanted to get out, and in the boat, I want to read. Why don't he tell me what's happening to the other 11 that's in the boat?
What was
they're all looking at Peter like he's gone nuts. It's sort of like I remember one time my grandfather was doing a revival, and the Holy Rollers came into the revival. Have you ever been to a revival when the Holy Rollers came?
Yeah.
And the Pentecostals, they got to speaking in tongues and falling out, and one almost fell in my aunt's lap. Uh-huh. And I remember my uncle, who had a speech impediment at that time, said, we called her Boots. Her name was Geneva, but we called her Boots. And he was shouting, "Sit down, Boots. Ain't no need in you shouting." But the guy almost fell over him. Right, but so when you realize what transpires in all of this, I'm looking at what's going on in the boat. I'm thinking, here are the other 11. Who's at the helm? Who's there? And what are the others doing? And if you'd have been there, what would have been your eyes when Peter stepped out of the boat? You'd have thought, fool's going to drown. I mean, seriously, that's, but you got to realize something. He gave us a great story. As long as you and I keep our eye on Jesus, we're in good shape. But anyway, but the thing back is, when you think of all of this, it gets them wondering about the public ministry that Christ had, and the early church was using that centralizing teaching at that time. So this book of Deuteronomy is important to us, particularly in a lot of ways as it was for Jesus and it was for the earlier followers of the church. We got to realize the first ones into the church were Jews who came into the church, all right, and followed Christ into it. And then they started getting the Gentiles and everybody else. But it's important for us. It was important. Matter of fact, Stephen, do you remember Stephen? Was stoned, all right? And who was holding the cloaks while they did it? Old Saul, who became Paul, right? Well, going to realize when Stephen was before the Sanhedrin, which really and truly was a hostile audience. The Sanhedrin was the one that hired Paul to go and get Christ and get rid of the Christians and that sort of thing. But he was there. But he also, in his speaking to the Sanhedrin, which was the governing body of Judaism, he quoted from Deuteronomy. So it was important to us. And he gave Moses his message was, and he passed it on, and it's for us, as we look at this, for us to pass it on in our things about it. And, you know, what we're hearing Moses say to the Israelites, he's saying to us now, today, all right? And when we realize where we are, the context of the book of Deuteronomy, I don't know, the long years in the wilderness that they've floundered all around and traveled almost to the end. And then we look at when the date was and all of this and what was transpiring. And then we get to think about what's the relevance of Deuteronomy. As you were talking about being a casual reader, all right? We're unacquainted with the treasures that are in the book of Deuteronomy. It's there. But we may well ask how it messaged from the distant world of antiquity all the way into the applications in our contemporary life today. But it's there, and I'm glad we're looking into it. But if you go back through the book of Deuteronomy, there's timeless truths in it. All right. When I think of that, the 21st century society today needs the Deuteronomy's doctrine of God and revelation. And the other one he talks about in there is grace. Did you know that? Mm-hmm. We think of grace coming with Christ, but it was already here. God had already put it there in the midst of it. And it gets to talking about God. What is God to you today?
What is God what?
God to you.
To me.
Today's generation, we think that we need to sort of get a balanced doctrine of God in his unique, and we were talking about it the other week, triune nature. In other words, Father, Son, the Holy Spirit. We need to, the triune being. We want it, but it's talked about in the book of Deuteronomy. Not in the words that we're talking about it, but it's there. It's like reading in between the lines and all of a sudden say, oh, this is what he said, all right? So God is so great. Deuteronomy is telling us that our limited spiritual life as well as our intellectual capacities we have we can't fully comprehend it, all right? What do you have to do with a lot of things in science? You ever seen a molecule? You ever seen an atom? Or an electron on the outer ring? Or the mitochondria in the nucleus? Have we ever seen it? Well, electron microscopes has allowed us to do some of that, but most of it was out of faith. We realized that it was more than, and that's what we have to do with dealing with the Trinity. That's what we have to do, is dealing with it in our faith, the triune being. So we have trouble really and truly comprehending every aspect of God's nature that we have in our lives. So I just want us to think about that a little bit today.
I was thinking about that this morning. We were walking the dogs and the wind was really blowing. And you don't see the wind, but you know it's there. You can feel it.
Yeah.
And I think I feel God. I can feel him. And I know he's there.
Well, it's sort of like, yeah, that's right. Surely the presence is in this place. But we get that from where? We get that from our faith. Our faith is, but you're right. And you ever seen a miracle in your life?
Yes.
We probably not realizing it, but we have, when we think about it, But Revelation, we should also be enriched by the book, or the revelation of the book, not revelation, but revelation, it's a doctrine of it. It even talks about it. We'll get into it later as we go. And then it has the doctrine of grace that's in there. So we look at this, and then I think about contemporary issues today. This is what Mark has been able to find out or give us. If you read him, he gave you contemporary issues within his own life that brought about what he was talking about. And so we'll go into that here in a minute. But it's just a part of it, and the issues we have today. It deals with a wide range of social and ethical themes that are crucial and important to us today in the 21st century. So, reckless abandon. Chapter 2. I don't know what page number it says, Goldie, but it doesn't have a page number in it.
It just says chapter 2, rediscovering.
Yeah. What we're doing here in chapter 2, rediscovering the past. How many of you chased your ancestry? So what are you doing? You're trying to rediscover our past, aren't we? When we're dealing in all of this. But, you know, I like what he's saying here about the fact being is discovering a mystery from the past. When you're looking for your ancestors, have you found something that was you didn't know? It was a mystery in the middle of all of it? I was talking to Joy and I, we had a great lunch with, I didn't realize how much Nita and her brother and all, and what they've gone through in their life and what their family goes back and how they came over and everything. It was interesting to hear their history and coming into this. And so we were having a great visit of that. But that's what happened to Generation Rest, right? Realize what happened. They had a mystery in their past. What had they heard?
They heard that God didn't like them.
God didn't like me. God hates us. Where did it come from?
Their parents told them.
How many of you ever played gossip at a party as a kid? And they whispered something in your ear and you had to turn and whisper something in the next person's ear. And by the time it got all the way around, it was totally out of portion, wasn't it? Well, you got to realize, and I like the way Mark Davis has put this in here. He's talking about the tabernacle being like a modern day town hall where they all went, but everybody in the family didn't go.
No. One room.
Well, that's one reason, I'm sure. There wasn't room. But whoever was in there came back and told them what they heard. Can you imagine how it got warped?
Yeah.
Right? And he was talking about, the 40 years wandering, this is exactly what happened. Moses, but he begins to bring to mind from them the forgotten scene about what it was all about.
But who told those parents when they went back to the tent?
Whoever the family representative that was in the tabernacle came from there as what was told. Moses gave God's will and God's information at the tabernacle, all right? Now, not everybody in the family, you got to realize he had 1 million people he was escorting through the wilderness. So when you got to realize a tent had families in it, and it was sort of like, some of you remember, we used to have a thing called the administrative board in the Methodist Church when we were part of the United Methodist Church. And it had a representative from the church as a member in each facet of it that worked on a committee in that. And we had it, all right? We used to have charge conferences in the UMC that only the ones voting in the charge conference were those representatives that were in there could vote for it. Like Congress, all right? We have representatives in Congress. You and I can't vote on an act going on in the legislature, but they can. They're supposedly voting for us.
Oh,
yeah.
I do crack a joke every once in a while. But the fact being is, we realized that was what, answering your question, the tabernacle was like our legislature meeting. All right? And in that meeting was our representative who was there. Now, for the state of Arkansas, we have what? 4 representatives, 3 representatives. We have 2 senators over in the Senate. So when you look, they're the ones that only one can vote. And they're the ones that come back and tell us what transpired.
Why they voted that way.
And why they voted that way. All right.
So Moses told them they didn't believe Moses, and they just
Well, they just didn't get it the same.
They didn't get it. You see, they had heard all their lives. A lot of things happen to us sublingually too, realizing that. We come up with thoughts that where'd it come from? Well, it's sort of like, you ever been in surgery? Worked in surgery? No. You realize a lot of times the patient can hear everything that's going on.
Yeah.
Yes, you can.
Yeah.
So you have to be careful what you're really saying. Yeah. All right? The same thing happens but not everybody's hearing the same thing. For instance, you're going to leave here today and none of you are going to, no 2 of us are going to have the same answer of what transpired in here today.
Exactly.
We're going to talk by what we heard. It's sort of like when you were raising your children, did you ever say to them, what about no, do you not understand?
Yes.
And we do the same thing with God. And God says to us, do you understand no? And I don't mean it right now, but maybe later. But you see, Generation Rest had this told to them. They had a fallacy. They had believed everything they were told. Do you believe everything told to you on the newscast every night?
No, I don't believe in National Choir.
So
But it's
if you realize what's transpiring in our world today and the stuff that we're hearing and what we put to our minds, and I hear this person saying this thing and this person saying this thing, and they're 180 degrees out of phase with each other, it hasn't changed. It was going on 400 years before Christ. You see, so that was where we are. So they had heard that, but they come back, and then Moses is aware of that. I like what he says in here is he brings up a forgotten scene of the past. That's exactly what he was doing. He was bringing up to Generation Rest. Got to realize their parents weren't there anymore. You're aware of that, right? Those that started out the trek through the wilderness died before they got on the other side of it. And God says, and it was like he told Moses, you're not going to get into the promised land either. But Moses accepted that. All right. So, but remember, the Generation Rest, this is how they'd grown up. They'd grown up listening to stuff around the table. It may not have been the truth, but it was what the person that had been their family member at the tabernacle that came and told in their tent. And we have that going on. The going-ons in the tabernacle, as I said, is a modern-day town hall where Joy and I were watching some movie the other night, and they were saying they were having a town meeting, and they were going to vote on so-and-so. Well, who's going to vote? And so we went into all of this. It's been a town meeting. I remember those as a kid, but the tabernacle is actually a story of each family's tent. That's what it was, each family. And I like the way David's put that together. He said, and we had those areas. Can you imagine the stories?
Yeah. Oh.
But I got to thinking about that. Later, he brings up the fact that it was almost like Moses had a microphone in all the tents, and he was hearing all the tales being told. Where did he get that from?
God.
You're right. God had him. It said, "Listen, Moses, here, listen." All right, and he allowed him to think that. And so when his message would forever. But what he's talking to him, it forever changed the Generation Rest. It was sort of like Brooks's statement to the hockey team. It changed that hockey team, and the same thing happened with Moses there. It was almost. I'm sort of like reading what I went back and read several times, trying to figure out, as what David says, it was like Moses was already across the Jordan River. All right, he was telling them. In essence, he was telling them they were already there, but he was still on the east side of it. But I like the way he put it there. But he was taking care of the half truths that Generation Rest had heard in the tents. Those are half truths. Those were not truths that were there. And
so the promised land wasn't where they were. They were going to the promised
land. They
land.
had not got there yet. They have not crossed over.
So they all stayed there for 40 years before
the 40 years, and I didn't bring the maps over here. The 40 years they could have done in 11 days. They could have gone from Egypt to the promised land in 11 days, walking, all right? But they didn't. They kept arguing with God. God, we don't have food. We don't have water. You don't notice where we're going. God gave them light, a tower of flame to give them directions at night. He gave them a cloud during the day. He gave them manna to eat. He gave them water to drink. They still didn't grasp it. They were still thinking God hates us.
Was Moses there with them?
Oh, yes. He was the leader. Did you read my morning this morning?
No.
I think it was this morning, didn't I? I talked about Moses being in his first 40 years.
Yeah, it was this morning.
And then he was in his second 40 years.
My phone's out there.
Well, that's okay, but just read. And in his third 40 years, right, there were like 3 40-year sessions in Moses' life, all right? And he had 40 in the wilderness, all right? And then he had this, so it was there. So if you read that, I was making some things about it. He went from being a nobody to being somebody, all right, in all of that.
But none of them believed Moses
Well, they finally did.
after 40
The
years.
children did.
The children, what you're reading there,
Well, that's been a long time.
generation rest, that's the ones who have survived generation test. Their families, their parents have died off. They're on their own. They're moving forward. And he's got them there. And Moses is giving them an inspiring, encouraging speech that look what you got, you know. And they said, well, there were even those that said, we can't cross that Jordan River is flowing. And God said, Moses, have them take the ark and step into the river. And when they did that, what happened? If you read further, you find out that there was a blockage of the water and they walked in. And we're going from there. They did, you know, like the walls of Jericho. We've all sung that. But see, not everything that you hear in the tent is true. And, you know, when you were growing up and you were listening to your, you know, I don't know how y'all were in my family, but children always ate last.
Ate last?
We had to eat last.
No, we didn't.
That's why I always got the north end piece of a chicken flying south. So we didn't get to hear a lot of what was going on around the table. And when we finally got a little older, we got to sit up around the table and we got to hear the conversations of the adults, okay? And this is what has happened to Generation Rest. They have progressed through this, all of this diatribe that was going on, all of this saying, well, God hates us, all right? Well, if he didn't do that, why didn't he just set us free? There was one part they were saying, well, we'd have been better off if we'd stayed in Egypt as slaves.
Yeah.
Well,
They'd have food and water.
have food and water, that sort of thing. But that was where we are. But they can and did leave some indelible marks on their lives, all right? A lot of us have that happen in our lives. You know, we say things, people say things to us, and they hit us. Who has a dictionary? Who has their Bible? Look at Deuteronomy 1:26 through 28.
Deuteronomy 1.
1:26 through 28. You got to realize he's revealing what really happened, all right? And so I want you to hear it read. If you haven't read that part, I can pull it up on my phone.
Did you say 6 through?
26 through 28.
26. Okay.
26 through 28.
All right.
Listen to what he says.
But you were unwilling to go up. You rebelled against the command of the Lord your God. You grumbled in your tents and said, the Lord hates us. So he brought us out of Egypt to deliver us into the hands of the Amorites to destroy us. Where can we go? Our brothers have made our hearts melt in fear. They say the people are stronger and taller than we are. The cities are large with walls up to the sky. We even saw the Ankites there.
Which were giants. You got to realize this is what they had been told all of their life growing up. And Moses says, listen, you know, what you heard is untrue. But a lot of times if somebody told you what your parents said was untrue, what would you thought?
Why are they saying that?
All right.
Probably, it'd be hard to believe.
Yeah, right. But we're looking at this. He said, you know, it was sort of like, David says, it was like Moses put a microphone in all the tents and he heard all of the folly roll that was going on. And it was almost like when you read verse 27, it was almost like an exact recording of what was transpiring in the tents. And so that was when we were there. And when you realize that. But he knew that this inaccurate information, and he knew it was damaging. You know, they had done things. You know. But you got to realize, it's sort of like some of our lives. They had experienced life under the false assumption that God hated them.
Sometimes, though, what we believe, if we should know, I mean, God's put it where we know right from wrong. If it feels wrong, you don't do it. And it feels right.
Well,
we have a son-in-law that is died a few years ago, but he always said to his children, when they said, ask him a question, he says, do the right route. In other words, do what's right.
Yeah.
You don't have to come ask me. do right, do what's right, and that's where we are. You know, the half-truths of all generations have ever heard. So Moses told them that there was something different. Open your minds, all right? He said, not everything you heard in the tent is true. Well, in your life, have you ever been such a situation where everything that was said was not true?
Well, I think we all worry about false prophets.
Yes.
Well, yeah, we do that too. But you know, they were not the first to be marked with a careless spoken word. What happens in our world today. You know, how they think, you know, people don't like what we wear, they don't like what we think, they don't like what we look like, you know, what perfume are you wearing, you know. And so we get to all this kind of things, and we have to do it. And they, you know, and do you remember how cruel children can be to other children?
Oh, yeah.
They think things to them like fatty, all right, okay, you know, and you know, you don't have a high IQ, you're dumb. I heard a conversation at the Pine Bluff down at Cummins when they were talking to, and I was in the conversation, and there were prisoners there, and they were talking, and one of the prisoners says, "I became exactly what my father told me I would be."
Yeah.
Self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
He said, "My dad told me that I would go to jail." And he says, "Here I am." And do you realize what you know what your words do?
Yeah.
We don't a lot of times think, you know, well, it's sort of like I was sort of like aboard ship. I would be monitoring or having to call. Our captain of our vessel would be talking to the captain of another one that was in our fleet that we were running with, and they were talking about things. All of a sudden, you hear on the mic, click, click, click. You know what that was? That was that captain of that vessel telling the captain of my vessel, "I outrank you." That's what it meant.
Check it. Huh?
You know. So we have to do this. So that happens to us, and it was the same thing. In England, they used to wear their ties for whatever school they went to. And in other words, you didn't go to the right school, you didn't go to Eton, so you don't have any sense, and this kind of thing. And so we have that. We have all that growing up. It was sort of like, there was a great basketball player at LSU named Bob Pettit. Bob Pettit, as a high school, going to Baton Rouge High, was a tall, lanky kid. The coach at LSU at that time was Coach Rabelais. You know, that's a Cajun name as well.
Isn't it?
He got Bob to come in and practice in the gym because he knew what talent he had. He then brought in a ballet teacher to teach Bob movements and motions he had. He wound up being an all-pro in the NBA because all of a sudden, somebody like Moses to the wild told him, "You got this talent and you need to use it." All right, and so he was able to do that. So Generation X, Generation Rest, had Moses to clear up some inaccurate thinking, and that's what he did, and that's what you hear in this speech that we hear about this. And so it's important for us to think on that at times. You know, the lessons imparted to Generation Rest by their parents were based on, and I like what David says, based on their frustrations. Have you thought about that? Can you imagine the frustrations that went on for 40 years in the wilderness? Yeah. I know. Do you remember any time in your life when you were going through a frustrated period?
Yes, right now.
and so all of a sudden, you know, they were throwing out their frustrations. They were throwing out all their unbelief, you know, you know. But you got to realize something. You wonder why they were in there 40 years? God had a plan. God's plan, and God gave them the ability to protect themselves and to do the things, and so it was important there, you know. And God's plan was Moses is going to inspire them to go to the promised land and take it over. And the other thing he says, and I don't know if you read earlier in his book, there was nobody else at the gate of the promised land to enter. Why? It wasn't part of God's plan. And that's where we are. So they entered it, and we think of that today. And so we think, thank goodness.
So did they all enter the promised land?
Yes, all except Moses.
Except for Moses.
Yeah, all of generation rest.
So where did he go?
He had to stay. He died. As a matter of fact, if you read the very end of Deuteronomy, thoughts is that Joshua wrote the final thing because Moses had already died. We'll get into that later, but I don't want to confuse you today. But,
I mean, if it's 40, 40, 40, that's 120. He was an old guy.
how old was Methuselah?
Oh, well, yeah.
How old was Abraham?
Uh-huh.
All right.
Yeah.
And
I'm
so,
just saying.
you know,
It's time for him
In
to.
1 year, like 100 years there? Or
no,
50 years?
no.
not
1 year in
years.
God's time may be like 1,000 or a million years in our time.
Yeah.
All right. But that's when you and I think of time, what do we think in? Minutes and seconds and hours, 24 in a day. All right. And when you see something written that's 24/7 means what? They never close?
Right.
Well, God never closes either.
But that brings about a point. Everybody, if you ask them how long is a day, they say 24 hours. No day is 24 hours long.
No,
That's why we have to have leap year.
That's right.
Which comes up tomorrow.
Well, which comes up, but.
And I've written a
we
thing.
We think we have certain knowledge that we don't really have. We don't know the truth.
Right.
And that's a teacher talking.
Well, and Pluto's not a
A
planet.
day is 23 hours and 50
Somebody-
something minutes
yeah,
long. I
yeah.
can't remember the exact number.
That's a science
Well,
teacher.
and we can thank
Well,
we can thank the great Caesar for that.
But
Yeah.
that's why we have leap year. If we didn't, our seasons would all get off and everything else would be off. So every 4 years, we just kind of throw another day in there and that balances the books.
Well, we understand that the day is 24 hours and some odd minutes long, but the sidereal day is so many other, but we use 24 hours as simply a convention so that everybody's on the same
Oh, yeah.
page.
But what I'm saying is that I know, you and I know, and now everybody else I guess in here does too, knows that that's what we do, but if the majority of people, if you ask them how long is a day, they're gonna say 24 hours.
Well, yes, because we've been taught that.
Because of the convention.
Yeah.
But it's not the truth. So a lot of times what people say.
But if
they
you are
think is
if
the
you're
truth is
explaining
not
that to a
true.
third grader,
Yeah, explain it to a third grader.
Well, I have.
I bet you have.
And believe it or not, some of them get it.
Yeah.
But, everybody's not gonna get it. You can explain it to a 12th grader and some of them get it and some of them won't. I mean,
You can tell it took
well, it's sort of like I took plain geometry. Y'all remember plain geometry?
Oh, yeah.
And I always talk about
Me
Shelley
too.
Bailey. Mr. Bailey
Me
would take
too,
off his
Lola.
vest and never unbutton it. But anyway, that's another story. But we were taking plain geometry, and I'm bird hunting with a buddy of mine. All of a sudden, he says, "I got it! I'm thinking, what the heck are you talking about? You got it? He said, I said, what did you get? He says, I understand now what a straight line is between 2 points. I said, how did you get that? He says, because I could shoot. It was a straight line to that bird. And all of a sudden, he knew what a straight line was.
Made it.
And I'm thinking, okay, all right. And it was hard for me to grasp because I didn't, I knew all the plain geometry theorems and I knew what they were about. But he was my buddy who was a far better athlete than I. He could run with a football like I could never think about doing, but he had trouble grasping the simple thing. A straight line is between 2 points. Distance between 2 points. Shortest distance between 2 points. And so we have that. So everything you hear in the is not true. All right. And the other thing is they were grumbling because can you imagine grumbling?
Yeah.
Can you imagine the grumbling? and to the point that the grumbling got into rage. All right. In other words, and if you're doing that, it just feeds on itself. All right, and it becomes, and you do that, and so it was a form of intimidation that was there, and so we think there are people who just have the ability to look intimidating and say things in such a way that we are either convinced of what they say or too afraid to object to what they say. Our children used to say to me, "Dad, I wish you'd spank me rather than look at me or talk to me." All right. So we noticed that from the carefully placed microphone, so to speak, you got to realize God was ahead of us. You realize all that information in those tents were already filled into Moses' ears. Imagine how that went about. You know, we would love it. You know, think about it. That was long before we knew what Wi-Fi ever thought about me when we look at that. So we have to rediscover the past and what we're doing, and that's where we are. You know, thank goodness Generation Rest had Moses to clear up things for them, and to remove them, to get rid of the resistance they had from their grumbling that they'd heard all their life. And if you heard Deuteronomy 27, that was literally a quote like Deuteronomy 127, like it came right out of the microphone, and he's heard it. And then he goes on, he mentions something, and I'm sure it's gotten a question of you. He brings up a word that I'm not sure you're aware of, the Gnostic movement. You realize what the Gnostics are?
Yeah.
Gnosticism, in a layman's term, I think, was a religious movement within Christianity. All right. In other words, it was a sect within it. What do you have today in our Christian faith? We have different sects within it, SECTs. All right. And we have these kind of things happen. But that's where they were. All right.
They had their own little.
It held that the path to escape the suffering and the earthly realm lay through the acquisition of secret, listen to it now, divine knowledge. In other words, they were smarter than the rest of us. They were smarter than that second century members of the church. All right. Gnosticism was viewed as being heresy, all right, particularly by the Christian church, due to some important differences that they had with the official doctrine of Christianity. In other words, so our Christian faith is we have the faith by doing what? We're going to get there because we get it by faith. We get ours. So. And so there's some differences there. Gnosticism sort of loosely overlaps with Christianity. You got to realize both of them agree that God created the world, the Gnostics and the Christians. All right, they both believe. But the Gnostics believe that there were multiple gods, right? Including a transcendent God that is supremely good and an inferior creator God who made the material world. See, that was a big argument. Some people didn't believe God could be human and godly. In other words, he was God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. Christ was not only human, he was also divine. They had trouble with that. They had trouble grasping that idea. In other words, and so they adopted and interpreted several Christian teachings without adopting the standard beliefs of Christian faith. So the Gnostics were going around. How many have been to Salt Lake City? Been to Salt Lake City? Joe and I were there. We couldn't find a Methodist church.
I bet.
But anyway, they were there because why? Joseph Smith all of a sudden says this is the way it really was. Sort of different. They believe in Jesus Christ. Don't give me that. They call themselves the Latter Saint of Jesus Christ, Latter-day Saints. But that's a different sect within the Christian faith, all right? And they take communion different than the way we take communion.
Really? I didn't know.
And some faith, the doctrine of it, sort of like the Gnostics think, some think Christ died on a stake, not on a cross. So you have these different ideas within the Christian faith. You have different sects within it. So you have that thing there. Gnostics adopted and interpreted things differently. They believe that the material world is associated with error and suffering. In other words, they think of that. And they believe that the divine figure that created the material world is not supremely good or transcendent. That's why they were saying he can't be both. He can't be human and divine, because being human is evil. Being divine is so different. And so that was one of the fights that they had in the early church. And they prominently active in the second century church. And so we're thinking of that. Any thoughts on that? What were your thoughts? Does it sound familiar today?
Sure.
Do we don't call it Gnosticism today, but we do have different ideas about the church, don't we? We have different ideas about the Bible, for instance. All right. There's some people that says, well, the Bible is not the Word of God.
That's like we have atheists. They don't
That's
believe
correct.
in God.
That's another call for it. But what we really need to do is become better listeners and hear the Word. The thing about it is,
Well, what gets me that people like atheists don't believe in God. I mean, how do they think a little seed in your body gets a human being?
Well, you got to realize when I in my work when I was doing graduate work in embryology, and I saw things transpire. All of a sudden, I realized there had to be a mind far more masterful than I ever thought that could create what I had done. Can you imagine? Do you know what a fertilized egg is?
Fertilization?
A fertilized egg. That's an egg that's got a rooster in the hen house, right?
Oh.
All right, that's an egg. If you look on an egg, there is in the yolk, there's a blastoderm that sits up on top of it, and some people won't. Oh, you did.
Yeah.
You can take that blastoderm and lay it under a dissecting microscope, and with a stained glass, pull it out to a fine wire, and cut that into sections. All right. And you can take those sections and put them against a fertilized egg in an incubator that already has started with a vessel going, and put it right by, close it back up, put it back in the incubator, and a time later, you can come open it up and there will be something growing there. And then you have to take that, so it's growing, and figure out what it is. I had one I took out and I said, wait a minute, this looks figure. Do you realize your cardiac muscle is a different muscle than the other muscles? Mm-hmm. And when I took this piece of tissue that was growing, all right, sublingually, I thought it was moving, but it may not have been. That was me. Right? But after I took it and processed it, put it in paraffin, put it on, and made slices of it, and looked at it under the microscope, guess what it was? It was cardiac tissue. Mm-hmm. Now that was in that blastoderm. No, it was when you look at that blastoderm and it becomes fertilized and starts growing. That's what becomes the embryo. That's what becomes the chick. And there are parts on that tell you exactly what this part is going to be in the chick. Same thing happens to us.
Well, we had a student who's they raised chickens.
Yeah.
I mean, commercial chickens.
Yeah.
And he brought a chicken in that had just a drumstick with a foot on it sticking out of its chest.
Yeah.
It was his twin.
Well, but that egg, I mean, something happened in that egg because it had an extra part to it. It had an extra little thing in there. And when that chicken, I mean, it grew a leg on the chicken's chest.
When Dr. Eames and I would allow that part, what we had put there to grow, then it would wind up being on that chick as an outside part to it. And that's how the drumstick.
Well, yeah, and Dr. Pole had to remove a leg off a calf. I don't know if y'all watched Dr. Pole, but it was going off with his back, you know. I mean,
but and I like what he said. He said, "I learned more," and so you can learn more. And it was interesting here, discovering courage, or not damage to the new generation, to the next generation that was there, and how advice came. He said. It was interesting. He said, I learned parenting from a man who had no children.
Yeah.
You read that? And it was sort of funny. How many of you have old maid aunts?
Have what?
Old maid aunts.
Old maid aunts, yeah.
And they can tell you how to raise your children.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, your aunts.
Old maid aunts who had no children, but they're the ones that had all the information on how to raise. At least it was in my family. And he's right. Moses made his own mistakes, right? And he witnessed them. And falsehoods are like notorious for thoughts about doing damage to our lives in our ways today. So when you think of this, what do you think? Moses did not believe a word of what he had heard from the next generation, and he gave them this to move forward. And I like what he talked about when he said about, I had a professor that was extremely successful. But did you read his life before he became successful? Mm-hmm. So you go back and read on that. That's on the page just before the question starts. Yep. But as Moses looked at the generation rest, sitting there on the banks of the Jordan River, He was like Brooks talking to the hockey team. He saw talent, all right? He could see that in them. He saw the potential of the previous generation that could not be seen. In other words, he saw them far beyond what there was. And they had now heard the real truth, and they were like the hockey team. They skated out on the ice. They stepped out into the river, and we need some of that. You know, you realize he says it. What Moses had was God's help in giving them reckless abandon in their life. That's what happened with the hockey team.
Yeah.
That was reckless abandon. And they just need some encouragement. We do too, don't we? How did you answer your questions?
Okay, which part?
Did you ever deal with a bully in school?
Who didn't? That's what I'm.
Or were you looked at as a bully? Yeah. And, what is something if someone said to you that has had a long-lasting impact on how you think of yourself? Thoughts?
I had someone tell me, I mean, I had a lot of bullying, and I didn't feel real good about myself. And I told people about it all the time, and I had a friend who changed the way I felt about myself. Number one, she said, Lola, you're 36 years old, give it up.
That's wonderful.
I mean, you know, I'm still, whoa, poor little
Well,
man.
enjoy.
You know, and just give it up. You know, your whole life is still ahead of you. You quit living in the past. Leave
That's
it
correct.
alone.
That's
The
wonderful.
past is past.
You can't do anything
You can't
about it. You can't change it.
If you try to relive it, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
Well, and I was in trouble. I mean,
Yeah.
I couldn't move forward. I was still mad at people.
There have been a lot of bullies in our children's lives.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
One thing I found out, and I do not like to say this, but sometimes you gotta treat a bully like you do a venomous snake.
Yeah.
Chop
Chop it off the head off. Now that's not nice.
But it's not
right,
that- but-
sometimes that's the only thing they do.
How many of you like watching Westerns? Particularly John Wayne Westerns.
Oh, yeah.
Well, we saw a remake of Red River with James Arness as playing the part that John Wayne played. And I've forgotten the young man's name that played what Montgomery Clift played, his adopted son. But there was a tremendous horseman in that group, and he was a young black man. And there were people that shied away from him, all right, including a young kid. He was saying, you need to learn, because he's the best bronco buster in the country. You need to learn from him. And he says, what?
Mm-hmm.
You know, he says, let me tell you something, son. You learn this in your life right now. You don't judge a person by what they look like. You judge them by what they are and do. You don't care what their color is. You don't care what their denomination is. And all of a sudden, out of this Western comes this thing saying, hey, get a life. Understand what is out there. And we do. And sometimes, and it wasn't so much the kid was a bully. The kid had been convinced, like they were in their tents, where people said, oh, you don't want to associate with them.
Yeah.
That went on in the tents. That went on in the homes. That's where they came from. And it's a hard thing for us to understand at times. Do you realize what influence we're making on the generation follow us by what we say and how we do it? And it's scary. I don't know about you, but me it does.
Usually a bully, too, has learned that behavior from somebody bullying
Who bullied them. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, it's right. And I've seen that happen. And I know the fact being is, because I knew a kid that was a bully, and his daddy was an obnoxious bully.
I was gonna say, their daddies.
Yeah.
Or
I found
neighbor
out
or whoever.
I
Brothers.
found out that this one boy that bullied me the most, I didn't find out until a couple of years ago that he was adopted. And the only reason they adopted him is to have somebody to do the work around the house, do farm work. And so he wasn't appreciated, he was used.
Well, we saw some of that. Do you remember the orphan trains or reading about them?
I read it.
Yeah.
Some of those orphans were adopted strictly to do the work on the farm. That's
You know,
tragic.
sometimes somebody doesn't intend what they do or say as being bullying, but we take it that way and keep it. That my first grade teacher sent a note home to my mother that I was flighty. Well, all my life, I've never forgotten that.
Sure.
Because it shocked me then. I thought, oh my goodness, I've really done something bad. But then later on, I thought, well, you know, flight isn't so bad.
Well, that's like the story he tells, and I thought of Joy when I was reading that about the kid that got passed to the 6th grade.
Yeah.
And he went, and what the teacher said, turned that professor's life totally around, because she said, it's sort of like Dr. Fred Craddock tells what happened to him in Tennessee one time. And he and his wife were traveling. Dr. Craddock was like I always think of him Wally Hall type looking, not Wally Hall, like the little comedian with the glasses. Anyway, Joy and I had a great dinner with him one time. But anyway, he and his family were traveling in Tennessee, and he was in the restaurant in Tennessee, out there close to where Loretta Lynn's home is. I don't know. And this guy come from table to table, and he was talking, and he says, "Oh Lord, don't let him stop at my table." And he said, came over there, and he said, he started. He was the governor of Tennessee. He'd been the governor of Tennessee. He was out there, but he was telling what transpired to him. He said he was always treated like he was a fatherless child. In other words, they had another word for it. Started with a B when you and I were growing up, you know. But he was talking about what he was, and he was at church, and on the way out, he said, the pastor says, "I know your father." And he said, "You do?" And he said, "Yeah, you're a son of God."
Oh, very good.
And he said, it made a difference. It's sort of like the professor when the teacher says, "Hey, you're not anything like they said you were." And you know, it's sort of like, that sort of thing. How did the generation rest feel when they finally heard that God did not hate them, but that he loved them dearly?
I put that surely softened their heart. They felt the deck was stacked against them before and found out that wasn't true.
It's a relief, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you saw the news yesterday, when that woman gave that $1 billion to the Methodist.
Oh my.
You see the kids, how the kids reacted. That's how they probably reacted.
She gave $1 billion, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So when they
And
believe,
she gave it to whom?
Medical school.
Medical school, yeah. Albert Einstein Medical School, yeah.
Those kids that jumped up and hugged each other.
Which means all their tuitions were paid.
That's the way those people are.
That's a great thing.
Yeah, right there.
Have you ever verbalized something that you wish you could take back?
Oh, yeah.
All my shoes used to say, insert in mouth from left, all right? I would always stick my foot in my mouth.
Yeah.
You do, yes.
And what's 3 encouraging things you could say to someone younger than you or someone in a position beneath you? What would you say?
I'll help you.
What?
I'll help you.
Yeah.
That's good.
You can do this.
That's right.
You know, I was gonna say, do the best that you can.
I will, when I need to, I will kick your butt. But why I'm doing that is because I want you to succeed and surpass me.
Yeah. Well, all of our thoughts were, and I can remember my mother always saying to me and to my brothers and I, is that I want you to be a head taller than what I, not in height,
Yeah.
but in what you accomplish in the world.
Nice.
I didn't get above her playing the piano though.
Okay, a question on the people that started, the new generation believed that then. Did they go make it to the promise? I mean, did
You're
they
gonna find
run
it, yes.
in and went on?
I'm gonna let you know the end of the story, but we're gonna pick our way there. Yes, they get there. They cross over and they do conquer it. All right. And so what he kept telling them, you've had battles coming to here and you won. Why do you fear this group? Right? Because they'd heard it. You can't do this. They're too big. They're giants.
Yeah.
You know?
See,
And they used to say, the tallest tree can fall.
Yeah.
Right.
like the best swimmers can drown.
As a teacher, number 5 is something that all teachers have to do
Yeah.
to be successful with their students, or
That's
have
correct.
the students be successful. It's encouraging them, and there's a million ways to do it. There is no one way.
Right.
But so far, how have you liked it?
Sometimes all it takes is just walking over and going.
Yeah, that's all they
I mean, that's it. Just look at it. That's it. And physical touch, they really kind of discourage that with older kids, but it's not true. Physical touch is really important.